The tension was palpable from the very first moment of the hearing. No one spoke, no one whispered, only that hollow silence that fills a room when everyone senses something is about to go terribly wrong, but no one knows from where it will strike. It was a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. The hearing was scheduled as a routine discussion on ethics and responsibility in public media, but everyone in the chamber knew that routine was just a facade before things spiraled out of control. The cameras of PBS and C-SPAN were already rolling, though few expected anything truly explosive to happen. Howard Stern, the famed radio host, now at the center of a controversy over a charitable media fund, had agreed to appear voluntarily. This was unusual given his tendency to avoid direct questioning from oversight committees. Stern arrived just before 9 a.m., dressed in a sharp black jacket, dark sunglasses resting atop his head, lips pursed in an expression that was impossible to read. He was there to defend the recent restructuring of a youth outreach initiative funded by media industry donations, a program now accused of funneling money into unrelated entertainment projects. Seated at the far left of the semicircle, Jonathan Roumie, the acclaimed actor known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen and a prominent advocate for ethical storytelling, flipped through a folder of documents as if it were just another day at the office. His face was calm, unreadable. Only occasionally did he tap the edge of the table with his pen, slow, deliberate, almost like a countdown. The committee chairman, a veteran congressman with a too-tight tie, cleared his throat and gestured for Stern to begin. Stern leaned forward, adjusted his microphone, and started his statement in a calm, rehearsed voice. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm here today as a private citizen and an artist," he began, sounding as polished as a PR-approved press release. He spoke about legacy, free speech, and his supposed commitment to social good. Some members nodded absently. Most checked their phones. Only Jonathan seemed fully engaged. 20 minutes later, as Stern turned the second page of his prepared remarks, Jonathan raised his hand. "Mr. Chairman," he said firmly. The room fell silent. "I'll allow Mr. Stern to finish his statement," the chairman said. "I won't take long," Jonathan replied evenly. "But in the interest of transparency, I believe the commission should be aware of certain undisclosed connections relevant to today's topic." Stern blinked, visibly surprised. The chairman hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed, but be brief." Jonathan wasn't in a hurry. He had the calm air of a man who knew he was holding something explosive and didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. "I request that the record include a series of encrypted messages recovered from a private communications server linked to the administration of the Media Responsibility Fund between 2018 and 2021, Jonathan announced. These messages, along with recently verified travel records, raised serious concerns about whether Mr. Stern exerted personal influence over key funding decisions, while maintaining a relationship with the fund's leadership that went far beyond accepted institutional norms. The air in the room grew cold. A journalist whispered in the gallery. Stern froze, then shifted nervously in his seat. Jonathan lifted a copy of the messages. These communications suggest frequent off-the-record meetings, some coinciding with budget discussions for education, arts, and community programs. None of these meetings appear in official records, but Mr. Stern was present. So was I. A murmur rippled through the room. Members of Stern's team leaned in, whispering urgently. "Are you implying inappropriate personal conduct, Mr. Roumie?" the chairman asked. "I'm not implying anything," Jonathan said calmly. "I am presenting verified communications. The commission and the public can draw their own conclusions." Finally, Stern spoke, his voice tense. "This is a lie. Do you want to deny it under oath?" Jonathan asked, turning slightly toward him. "I said it's a lie, and frankly, it's disgusting," Stern shot back, his voice trembling ever so slightly. That was the moment everything shifted, not because of what Jonathan had said, but because of how Stern had responded. Not with facts or documentation, but with emotion and a defensive insult. The cameras swung toward Jonathan. The chairman called for order, but it was clear the hearing would not return to routine. Jonathan sat back, sliding a second folder forward, marked with a single black dot. "This communication," he began, "is dated July 17th, 2019. 4 days before the fund quietly adjusted its allocation of grants for youth arts programs across multiple states." He read aloud, "Let's meet early. I don't want anyone else in the room. It's better when it's just the two of us." Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber. "This message," Jonathan continued, was sent from Howard Stern's known encrypted account to a contact traced to the fund's executive office network. Travel records placed Mr. Stern in Los Angeles that same morning, the same day a private meeting occurred to redirect grant funds. There is no public record of that meeting. No notes, no witnesses. That message is out of context, Stern protested. I'm just quoting your own words, Jonathan replied, calm but unyielding. I'm not just accusing, I'm asking why policy changed days after these meetings. Stern crossed his arms, scowling. This kind of accusation, Stern scoffed, is exactly why serious people don't want to deal with government committees. It's disgusting. It's not an accusation, Jonathan replied evenly. It's a question, and you still haven't answered it. An opposition congressman jumped in. Really? We're going to waste this hearing debating tabloid-level conspiracy theories? Jonathan turned his head slightly toward him. Congressman, if you want to call verified travel records of the Media Responsibility Fund tabloid theories, then please make sure that's in the minutes. The congressman mumbled something under his breath and stayed quiet. There's more, Jonathan continued. March 3rd, 2020, just 22 days before an $89 million grant was awarded to a Los Angeles consulting firm that later admitted to having close ties to Mr. Stern. He arrived in Santa Monica the night before. No official record exists of that meeting. However, a hotel employee filed an anonymous report last year about the arrival of a high-profile guest and how the elevator was locked for private use by only 2 people between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. At that, Stern's voice tightened. Are you implying something inappropriate happened between us, or that there was corruption? Jonathan shook his head slowly. I'm pointing out that a series of decisions, money transfers, and off-record meetings follow a consistent pattern. This isn't personal, it's about accountability. The room went still. In the awkward silence, someone coughed. Jonathan returned to his folder, sliding out a black and white photograph. This image, he said, was taken by an employee who, at the time, didn't think it was important. It shows Mr. Stern and me leaving through the back door of a private estate in Malibu. No formal reason was ever given for the visit. Yet 2 weeks later, funding for community emergency services in the area was quietly reduced. The owner of that estate is the CEO of a private company that, months later, received a substantial subcontract from the Media Responsibility Fund. The committee chair looked like he wanted to intervene, but didn't. For the first time, Stern looked directly into the cameras. His voice dropped. I will not allow myself to be dragged through the mud. That's why I came here in good faith. Then answer the questions, Jonathan said simply. The chair raised his hand. We'll take a short recess. But it was already too late. The press gallery was on its feet. Trotting question. Mr. Stern, have you influenced the fund's decisions? Mr. Roumie, do you believe Stern is hiding something? Jonathan didn't respond. He simply gathered his folders and stood, like a man who hadn't even started yet. The storm wasn't outside the room. It was brewing inside it. Stern leaned forward. I would like to respond directly to these accusations, he said, his voice seemingly calm, though strained. The chairman nodded. Not once have I used my position to inappropriately influence the fund's decisions, Stern declared. These insinuations are offensive, beneath the dignity of this chamber. Jonathan didn't blink. He let him continue. Yes, I've had private meetings, Stern admitted. Of course I have. I'm a senior advisor to the fund. That's my job. That's not a scandal. But those meetings aren't in the official records, Jonathan interrupted softly. Not all conversations appear on a public agenda, Stern shot back. And that's the problem, Jonathan said sharply. There is no oversight when access is private and the decisions are public. Stern exhaled hard. This isn't about oversight. This is about humiliating me on national television. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. If you feel humiliated, that's not my doing. I'm here to ask questions, not to attack you personally. Several committee members shifted uneasily in their seats. The tension had spread beyond Jonathan and Stern. Now the entire room was holding its breath, wondering if this could lead to real consequences. The chair broke the silence. Mr. Stern, can you confirm or deny the authenticity of the communications presented? I've never seen them before, Stern replied. And I'm not going to comment on private, unverified materials. So you're not denying those meetings happened? Jonathan pressed. What I'm saying is that context matters, Stern countered. I meet with people. That's my job. Anything else is pure theater. The word theater fell heavy in the room. Jonathan smiled faintly. If this is theater, then the public deserves to see the entire performance. I'm requesting an independent review of the server data and travel records presented today with full subpoena power. The committee jolted. That's outside today's agenda, the chair protested, but entirely within the jurisdiction of the Ethics Committee, Jonathan replied, never raising his voice. And this isn't about a single person. It's about a pattern. If we ignore it, we're telling the public that private influence over public trust is acceptable. Is that what this body stands for? No one answered. You're just exploiting headlines to boost your profile, Stern muttered. Maybe, Jonathan said quietly. Or maybe I'm doing the job I was called here to do, holding even the most protected among us accountable. The murmurs this time weren't noise. They were doubt. The kind of doubt that makes people re-examine everything. Stern leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on Jonathan, saying nothing. Sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. Jonathan waited for the whispers to fade before opening his final folder. Unlike the others, this one wasn't filled with printed emails or highlighted paragraphs. It contained color photographs, annotated screenshots, timestamps, and maps, visual evidence that needed no interpretation. I'd like to present several items of evidence for the record, Jonathan announced, without looking at Stern. They include GPS metadata from official flights, hotel staff shift logs, and surveillance recordings from facilities leased by the fund. One photo in particular caught everyone's attention. The photograph showed Stern slipping out a side door of the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles at 11:34 p.m., flanked by a security detail, but not his usual bodyguard. A man in a black coat looked down at his phone. The metadata placed this moment just 2 nights after Jonathan had attended a private lobbying dinner at the same hotel. Days later, a subtle change to a key media infrastructure bill passed, one that ended up benefiting contractors with close ties to Stern's circle. Jonathan didn't narrate every detail. He let the images do the talking. This isn't about catching someone in a lie, he said quietly. It's about showing that those with the most influence are often the most shielded from scrutiny. That shield should not exist for public figures or those managing public funds. Stern shifted in his seat, biting his lip. The cameras caught it instantly. Another image appeared on the screen. Stern and Jonathan, seated together on a private jet in October 2020. No press, no public itinerary. Jonathan pointed to the timestamp in the recorded flight path. Mid-air, the plane diverted to Santa Ana. That same week, a lucrative broadcasting contract for a state prison system was reassigned to a supplier whose director had just made a substantial donation to the Media Responsibility Fund. This is a smear campaign, Stern snapped. You're connecting dots that have no relation. Then help us disconnect them, Jonathan replied evenly. An aide behind Stern leaned forward, whispered something, and slid him a note. Stern read it quickly, folded it, and tucked it under his notebook. I'm not going to dignify this circus, Stern said sharply. These aren't crimes. You're taking personal moments and twisting them into something sinister. This isn't about personal moments, Jonathan countered calmly. It's about patterns and timelines. If it walks like coordination and sounds like coordination, he left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air. Representative Marisol Garcia, a centrist who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Mr. Roumie, are you suggesting that Mr. Stern acted as a policy advisor outside his formal role and without oversight? I'm not suggesting, Jonathan replied. I'm showing you evidence that points exactly to that. Garcia glanced at the committee chair. Then I support a formal review. The room shifted. Jonathan had been carrying the weight alone until now, but suddenly someone else stepped onto his side. Stern looked at her, bewildered. I don't know what you think you're seeing, he said, but my work has always been ethical, structured, and transparent. Then prove it, Garcia shot back, because right now it doesn't look that way. There was a long pause. Stern opened his mouth, then shut it. His lawyer leaned in, whispered something, and tapped the table gently. The chair cleared his throat. The committee will take another recess to determine next steps. No one moved. The press didn't leave. Live viewership was breaking records, and screenshots of the evidence were already flooding social media. Jonathan leaned toward his mic before the broadcast cut to the recess graphic. There's more, he said, loud enough for Stern and the country to hear. But I'll let you decide how much of it you want on record. Once you drop a spark like that, it's no longer up to you whether the fire spreads. When the committee reconvened, the atmosphere had changed. No one was scrolling their phones. All eyes were locked on the hearing room. The chairman looked cornered, not guilty, but like a man realizing the rules no longer protected him. I remind everyone this is a formal procedure, he began. We expect decorum and relevance in all discussion. Jonathan sat serenely, hands clasped. Stern sat upright, playing the part of composure but avoided looking at Jonathan or anyone else. Representative Garcia spoke again. Mr. Chairman, I move to suspend the rest of today's agenda and focus entirely on the materials presented by Mr. Roumie. It was a bold move. Garcia was known for quiet strategy, not public confrontation. Something had shifted. That is highly irregular, the chair objected. As irregular, Garcia replied, as encrypted communications from a public figure directing decisions without oversight. A low murmur of assent moved through the room. Some who had clung to neutrality were now shifting away from it. Stern leaned forward. I'd like to make a statement. Jonathan leaned back, giving him space. I didn't come here expecting this circus, Stern said. I came to discuss public media projects. Instead, I'm facing a political attack. Then let's focus on the facts, Jonathan replied. You say this is political? Fine. Tell me which dates are false, which messages are fabricated, which trips didn't happen. You know I can't talk about classified travel, Stern shot back. They weren't classified, Jonathan said. They were omitted. There's a difference, Stern insisted. The chair leaned toward his mic. If there's going to be an independent review, it must follow procedure. Of course, Jonathan replied. I'll prepare a formal motion. Then unexpectedly, conservative Representative Jorge Melendez asked to speak. Before this disappears into bureaucracy, I want to say something. Whatever your stance, we've let too much slide for too long. We owe the public transparency, even if it means uncomfortable questions. It stunned the room and Stern. I'm not saying I believe every detail, Melendez continued, but I believe the people deserve answers. Thank you, Congressman, Jonathan said quietly. The chair, visibly uneasy, finally announced, the motion to suspend the agenda is under review. We'll take a 5-minute recess. He banged the gavel and disappeared through the side door. The tension barely eased. Jonathan stood and began walking toward the back exit. Slow, deliberate, no smile. Stern watched him go, his hand clenched into a fist beneath the table. An aide leaned in and whispered something into Stern's ear. He didn't respond, his jaw clenched. Outside the committee room, journalists were already crowding the hallway, firing questions like confetti. Jonathan ignored them and headed straight for the stairs, avoiding the cameras. He wasn't chasing the spotlight, but the spotlight was coming anyway. Because once people start paying attention, yesterday's silence begins to sound a lot like complicity. By mid-afternoon, Jonathan's questioning was everywhere. Snippets of the hearing flooded Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, even Reddit. Some clips were barely 40 seconds, just long enough to show Jonathan calmly holding up the photo of Stern leaving through the side door of the Intercontinental Hotel. Others were full 10-minute uploads, complete with analysis from legal experts, influencers, and former officials. The hashtag Stern Scandal had already passed 5 million views, and it hadn't even been 12 hours. But what really ignited the firestorm was footage someone unearthed from October 2020. A grainy nighttime recording from a local Los Angeles newscast showing a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the back of a building. The visit had never been explained. The shot was poor, the lighting terrible, but the timestamp matched the flight data Jonathan had cited earlier. A lone figure stepped out of the second SUV. No press, no witnesses, just security and shadows. Internet sleuths pounced. Is that Stern? Why was he there? What was he doing stepping out of that SUV? Every second was dissected. And the more people looked, the more it seemed to fit Jonathan's timeline. Jonathan's file already included hotel staff reports, GPS tags, even elevator keycard logs. Now, this forgotten broadcast clip felt like confirmation. Stern's defenders scrambled. His communications director issued a brief statement around 4 p.m. Today's hearing was marked by political theater and misleading interpretations. Mr. Stern has always acted with integrity, but the words rang hollow. There was no denial, no explanation, just vague language, far too vague for the moment. Meanwhile, Jonathan hadn't spoken to the press at all. He didn't need to. His team quietly shared a 12-page PDF with the committee's press corps titled Immediate Transparency. It included redacted flight logs and screenshots of metadata, all time-stamped, all sourced. The pressure built. Journalists who had brushed off the hearing that morning were now digging into old visitor logs. Talk shows were inviting ethics professors and body language experts. One analyst remarked, Stern's reaction wasn't the anger of a man falsely accused. It was the tension of someone losing control of the narrative. That one stung. Back at the assembly building, Stern waited for his car in a private room. His advisors were silent. Phones buzzed with unread messages. Stern stared at the carpet, barely blinking. They weren't supposed to have that, his lawyer muttered. Stern looked up. Have what? The folder. The photo from the Intercontinental. That's not public. That came from someone on the inside. You think it was someone from the old team? The lawyer asked. Stern didn't answer. He just stared into space, because no one dared say it aloud. Jonathan hadn't guessed about those meetings. He knew them all. Every place, every coded message. This wasn't coincidence. Someone close to Stern had been leaving breadcrumbs for Jonathan. Someone who no longer wanted to stay silent. Outside, the car arrived. Stern stood slowly, face tight. I'm not answering anything until I know who leaked this, he said. His lawyer sighed. The leak isn't the problem. Public perception is. Stern didn't reply. Meanwhile, Jonathan's office was calm. No victory speeches, no press parade, just an aide walking down the hallway with a new stack of printed emails and another sealed folder under his arm. While Stern was stuck in damage control, Jonathan was already preparing for round two. The hallway outside Stern's private room was quiet, but inside the atmosphere was tense. His chief advisor, Vince Reyes, paced in circles, sweat soaking through his collar. Another aide, Carla, stood in the corner furiously typing on her phone. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence after someone's been caught in a lie and still doesn't know how much of their story has already collapsed. Stern sat on the edge of a beige sofa, jacket still on, makeup intact but visibly worn. His fingers tapped the side of a water bottle he hadn't even sipped from. 5 minutes passed without a word. Then he muttered, "Who gave it to him?" Vince stopped pacing. "We don't know, but someone had access to documents we never cleared for release." "Not just documents," Stern said quietly. "The photos, the timestamps, the messages, that's not a public records request. That's inside information." "You think someone switched sides?" Vince asked. "We don't have a leak," Stern corrected. "We have a traitor." Across the building, Jonathan sat with 3 aides and a man from the Oversight Subcommittee who had flown in from Santa Monica that morning just to meet him. His name was Richard Baines, a quiet, methodical investigator known for avoiding the press and digging deep where others skimmed the surface. "This is bigger than an ethics hearing," Richard said, flipping through the evidence Jonathan handed him. "I've been waiting for someone to open this door," Jonathan admitted. "I just didn't expect it to swing open so fast." Richard held up a flight log. "You checked this against immigration records twice?" "No, the second confirmation came from an anonymous contractor at the ministry. Everything matches." Richard nodded. "The encrypted emails? They're sanitized versions of private messages recovered from a hard drive seized during a 2022 fraud investigation. That drive came from a former advisor to the previous administration. Most people thought it was junk." Jonathan shook his head. "It's not junk, it's leverage." Richard didn't smile. "Leverage like this makes people nervous, not just Stern, but everyone who's benefited from the same game." "I'm not here to burn the whole house down," Jonathan replied, "just to show the rot in the beams." Richard looked at him steadily. "Get ready. People don't stay quiet when their money's on the line, especially those who've never heard the word no." Meanwhile, Vince and Carla were on the phone with a crisis consultant, an old friend from Stern's inner circle, a specialist in delay and distraction. "We're preparing a press offensive to discredit the hearing," the strategist said over speakerphone. "We can get statements from allies of the old media board and frame this as a political spectacle," Stern said, staring out the window. "No one will buy it if we don't explain the documents," his communications strategist replied. "That's not the move," the strategist continued. "The move is to cast doubt on the source. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is making people question where it came from." "And if the person leaking this keeps going?" Stern asked. The strategist paused. "Then consider proactive legal action. Force Roumie to reveal his sources. If he refuses, claim it's fabricated. If he complies, scare the next one into silence." Silence hung heavy in Jonathan's office. His assistant knocked. "Request for an interview," she announced. "From the press?" Jonathan asked. "No, from the Legislative Oversight Council. They want to know how far this goes." Jonathan stood. "Tell them I'll speak, but not behind closed doors. When you make something public, you protect it. And I have no intention of burying anything. The committee room was still half empty when Congressman Vincent Rivas walked in, not the type anyone expected to step forward. A quiet, rural legislator with no social media accounts, but known for reading every page of every file. When the hearing resumed, the committee chair was about to skip the topic and return to the agenda on media transparency and charitable foundations. But before he could open his mouth, Rivas switched on his microphone. Before we continue, I'd like to revisit the motion submitted by Mr. Roumie regarding a formal review of the evidence presented today. The chair blinked. That motion is still under consideration, and I support it, Rivas cut in. It would be a mistake to let what was shown today slide. Stern, sitting 2 seats away, turned toward him. His expression wasn't angry, it was betrayed. Are you serious? He asked, loud enough for the microphones to catch. It's not personal, Howard. It's procedural, Rivas replied calmly. You're legitimizing a smear campaign, Stern shot back. I'm only saying the facts deserve to come to light. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. Jonathan nodded slightly. Thank you, Representative Rivas. I'm not defending your conclusions, Rivas added, without looking at Jonathan. I'm defending your right to ask the question. The chair adjusted his tie. Let's remember, this committee is not a court. This is not a criminal proceeding. Understood, Rivas said. But we are legislators, and if we won't investigate conduct that crosses the line between influence and irregularity, why are we here? A silence fell, the kind that comes when someone finally says the obvious out loud. The chair muttered, "We'll vote later this week." Too late. The shift had already begun. Within hours, headlines exploded. Ruling party congressman breaks ranks to support Roumie's motion. It didn't matter that Rivas wasn't endorsing Jonathan's conclusions. He had opened the door to a full investigation. Stern stayed motionless, but his white-knuckled grip on his pen gave him away. He leaned toward his aide, Carla. We need to find out who convinced him. Meanwhile, Jonathan scribbled one word in his notebook. Leverage. No smiles, no celebration, just patience. This wouldn't be decided in a single day. The facts weren't going anywhere. The room no longer looked at him as a troublemaker, but as someone with evidence and the composure to back it up. Representative Marisol Garcia exchanged a brief glance with Rivas. Not an alliance, but an acknowledgement. Outside the chamber, the ripple was growing. An NGO formally requested all security and visitor logs for the dates Jonathan had cited. Journalists began comparing his statements to archived footage, tax returns, and property records. The puzzle pieces were sliding into place. Inside, the real change wasn't the evidence itself, it was the shift in attitude. Lawmakers who had avoided Jonathan's eyes that morning now sought him out when he spoke. Attendees who had rolled their eyes before now followed him in the hallway asking for copies of exhibits he hadn't even presented yet. Because once truth begins to resonate in a room, those pretending not to hear can no longer ignore it. By dawn the next day, the story dominated national news, not buried under weather updates or economic reports, but leading the broadcasts. Anchors used words like explosive, shocking, and possibly historic. Even networks that usually avoided media scandals couldn't ignore it. Stern's team scrambled for damage control, arranging a friendly pre-recorded interview with a sympathetic talk show host to focus on his charitable projects. But the public wasn't buying it. The comment sections were merciless. Where's the explanation for the hotel meetings? Why avoid the records? For every polished talking point, there were 10 screenshots from the hearing, each more damning than the last. Jonathan, meanwhile, said nothing. No tweets, no interviews. He let the facts speak, and that silence made him stronger. The silence of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. In his downtown DC office, Jonathan's team met early. Half hadn't slept. Phones wouldn't stop ringing. Emails poured in from voters, whistleblowers, legal observers, and surprisingly, 3 former officials from the old media board offering confidential information. Jonathan walked in with a coffee he didn't drink, eyes sharp. Let it roll, he told them. We're not chasing cameras, we're chasing the truth. The phrase was simple, but it carried weight. Even some pro-Stern lawmakers were holding private meetings, not out of sudden moral awakening, but because their donors were watching, and donors hated uncertainty. Rivas faced pressure to explain his stance. He didn't back down. If asking the right question scares some people, he told reporters, maybe they're a part of the problem. At noon, the Oversight Subcommittee issued a statement. A preliminary review of the evidence presented by Mr. Roumie is underway. Further details to follow. That single sentence was enough to confirm it. What Jonathan had started was no longer just a headline. It was officially in motion. Now it was no longer just a scandal. It was a process. Stern canceled 2 public appearances. A press dinner in Manhattan was called off at the last minute. Rumors swirled that his inner circle had gathered for a closed-door crisis meeting. No one could confirm his exact whereabouts. Some speculated online that he might disappear from public life for a while. Others joked about a self-imposed siege inside his penthouse. The truth was simpler and harsher. Stern was not used to losing control. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie received a letter, hand-delivered, not emailed, from a former communications staffer who had once worked closely with the Media Responsibility Fund's leadership. The letter was short, but it cut deep. You're asking the right question. There's more where that came from. I don't want immunity. I want to be heard. Jonathan folded it carefully, set it aside, and looked out his office window. His phone buzzed, a message from his mother. I saw the hearing. I'm proud of you, but be careful. These people don't play fair. Jonathan smiled faintly. He already knew. But this was never about playing it safe. It never had been. The people who had been untouchable for years were finally starting to be reached, not with slander or cheap shots, but with real questions that didn't just sting, but stayed. Jonathan wasn't trying to destroy anyone. He was trying to remind the country that power without scrutiny becomes something dangerous, something rotten, hiding behind prestige and money. And now the country was watching. Because once a story like this reaches people's living rooms, kitchens, and commutes, once it stops being just political and becomes personal, there's no silencing it. 3 days after the hearing, Jonathan sat on a wooden bench outside a small community arts center in Queens. No cameras, no makeup, no prepared remarks, just him, a warm spring breeze, and a small group of college students who had asked him to speak. He wasn't there to talk about Stern or the committee. He was there to talk about the truth, what it costs, what it demands, and why it matters. One of the students, maybe 19, leaned in and asked the question on everyone's mind. How did you know they weren't going to shut you down? Jonathan studied him for a moment. He thought about the early mornings, the hours of research, the anonymous tips from people too afraid to attach their names. He thought about the countless times he'd sat in a room and watched the powerful stare at him like he didn't exist. Finally, he answered, I didn't know, he said simply. The group went silent. I didn't know if they'd cut my mic, Jonathan continued. I didn't know if the chair would shut me out. I didn't know if the next day they'd drag my name through the mud. But I did know this. I had to say it anyway. Because if we keep letting fear write the rules, nothing will ever change. It wasn't a speech. It was just the truth. Back at the Oversight Committee, Jonathan's formal request for an independent investigation had been quietly submitted. No headlines, no press release. But the process had begun, and that meant Stern would be called to testify again. This time under legal conditions he couldn't manipulate. His team tried to stall, citing security risks, scheduling conflicts, even emotional distress. It didn't matter. The machine was already moving. The headlines had cooled slightly, but the questions hadn't. Late-night hosts were still talking about it. Political podcasts dissected Jonathan's strategy. Civil rights groups praised his persistence. Even former federal prosecutors were weighing in, not about the drama, but about the ethics. The country wasn't just witnessing a scandal. It was witnessing a shift, one where famous last names no longer acted as armor, where proximity to influence no longer excused you, where an ordinary citizen could walk into a room, pull out a folder, and make the entire system flinch. Jonathan didn't see himself as a hero, and he wasn't seeking to be one. He was just tired of watching people with money and fame skirt the rules everyone else had to follow. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about Stern. It was about the truth, about what happens when people stop whispering and start speaking out loud. In the end, it wasn't the documents or even the photographs that cracked Stern's image. It was the reaction, the silence, the defensiveness, the lack of a clear denial. Because the truth has a strange way of showing itself, not all at once, but in pieces. And when someone's trying to hide something, even their pauses can be heard. The final lesson was this: power is only dangerous when no one asks where it's been. So ask, even if you're scared, even if they tell you it's not the time, even if they tell you that you don't belong in the room. Ask anyway, because you never know how far the echo of a good question can travel. And if this story made you think even a little, subscribe to the channel. These stories matter, and you deserve to hear them told honestly.